It was perched on top of a lush green valley carved by the picturesque Rocky River. It stretched for miles to Lake Erie and was part of the thousands of acres of rustic parks that formed Cleveland's Emerald Necklace. That was on one side. On the other was, and still is today, Cleveland's Hopkins International Airport. The famed Lewis Laboratory is now the John Glenn Research Center. But before Neil could chase his dream of working and test flying for such a research center, he had to transition from fighter pilot back to the classroom. Most recognized Neil was more than a pilot with natural skills. He was smart, analytical, and blessed with an understanding of the technical. He returned to Purdue and cut himself a wicked schedule. His alma mater in the 1950s was influential in aviation, and he needed to complete his aeronautical engineering degree. It was no longer practical just to drive an airplane. You had to be much more, with an emphasis on research. There were the swept wings, Mach numbers, rockets, the lexicon of the budding New Age, and Neil recognized it was not only exciting, but a warning. Exciting because of the promise of rocket and space flight that lay just over the horizon, and a warning because being a pilot wasn't enough. There was also this little thing about his earning a membership in the Navy's Aviation Midshipman Program. It cut the cost to pennies. Neil doubled up on his classes. The outside world seemed to merge into a fog. He ignored it, logging one college credit after another. Just as important, Purdue was well underway building the first university airport. Neil managed flight time to stay efficient, and once he had his studies well in hand, he was content to spend a day here and there lazily. It wasn't that he hadn't anything grabbing his attention. There were plenty of co-eds filling out tight dresses. One in particular was Janet Sharon. She had been a person apart from the others Neil had known and whom he'd dated. While neither of them ever had broached the subject directly, the assumption rested quietly that a future between them waited. Janet had never pushed, and even in her unconcealed deep pleasure at greeting Neil, she was certain, as always, to keep their relationship unstilted and undemanding. Neil had, in fact, told his roommate he planned to marry Janet. Of course, given his tendency to keep his mouth shut, he never told her. The summer before his last semester, Neil presented his resume to the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, NACA. The agency was the forerunner of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, and the world's premier group for aeronautical research. Neil not only wished to be a research test pilot and engineer at the NACA's Edwards High-Speed Flight Station on California's high desert, he equally desired to play a major research role in the science of flight. Most assuredly, Edwards was where Neil Armstrong was convinced he fit. There was just one problem. When Neil was ready, Edwards wasn't. The high-speed flight station didn't have an opening. But what Neil didn't know, the cutting-edge high-speed flight group didn't wish to lose him. NACA sent his application to its other centers. The result was the Lewis Laboratory talked to me about filling an opening they had. It was the lowest-paying job I was offered, he said. But I think in retrospect it was the right one. At Lewis, Neil was given an old and very slow airplane. The Air Force called it a C-47. Airline drivers called it a DC-3. The Navy called it an R-4D. An R-4D was what NACA had, and the agency modified it as a flying laboratory. Neil grunted disapproval, but it was his. All his. It was perfect for studying winter ice buildup on wings and propellers. Neil soon learned the best way to study these icing conditions was during the winter months over Lake Erie. He flew his R-4D into freezing rain and shed lots of the frigid stuff on the lake's icy waters. That was fun. Not the other part. The only product of NACA was research